Yeah, Radhakrishnan, tell me when you want me to start. Yeah.
Hi everyone, this is Purajit and I'm very much happy about your presence. And knowledge is not about learning, it is about sharing. But knowledge which is not shared will have no impact on the society. In the process, to create a greater impact, Aaron Swartz Study Circle initiated the process of analyzing and understanding the best book and bringing their context into the medium where common people can easily get to know the stuff. In this journey, the Aaron Swartz Study Circle has hit the milestone of completing a book with 23 classes and stepped into 24th class, which is a final session of the book, Hacking Capitalism. To this, we have our chief guest, Mr. Prabir, President of Free Software Movement of India, who is also an editor of newsclick.in, and he is one of the founder of Delhi Science Forum. I'm very much happy to welcome you here, sir. Welcome you.
Thank you.
Okay, the session will move as an interactive one, which is mainly to clear all the doubts as a volunteer or as an activist on based on the hacker movement. With a note, I would like to wind up. Thank you, and once again, I'm very much happy to have you here, sir. Thank you.
So shall I start?
Sure, sir. Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak, particularly on a subject which, of course, today is very important because we have two issues which are in front of us. One is the congressional hearings which have taken place in the United States, in which the four big digital monopolies, what's called loosely as GAFA, they have been pulled up. Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. Interestingly, Microsoft, the original target of the free software movement or the FOSS movement, is not here. Though in terms of the size of what Microsoft is, it's as big, if not bigger, than some of the digital monopolies which have appeared before the Congress. So effectively, it should have been the big five we should have been called. But Microsoft has earlier come under the radar because of its monopoly practices with the Windows platform. So I think they got a pass this time because it is not in that sense the new digital monopolies the way other four are, who I would call are platform monopolies because they control a particular platform through which they get their power. Except, of course, Apple, because Apple really has a digital platform, the Apple mobile phone, the smartphone, where it has its maximum presence. Though, of course, it is also Mac computers, it has iPad, all those things. But really the control over the people, that comes from having Apple smartphone as a platform. So these are what I will call platform technologies. And these are the ones which came or were pulled up in front of the Congress for its monopoly practices. I'll come back to that in a moment. The second issue that is already under discussion in India, it's already taken place because of an extraneous reason, which is banning of certain apps. And banning of certain apps because it takes personal data of the people who use the apps and it can be sent back to their home countries. Now, given that India had a border clash with China, this has been used to ban 59 Chinese apps. This is also being used now by President Trump in the United States to argue that Chinese apps should be banned, and this follows up its what is called its trade and tech war with China, in which now it seems the Chinese apps are also being included. They have been given notice, TikTok being the biggest one, has been given notice that if it's not sold to an American company by 15th of next month, then it will not be allowed to be downloaded or used in the United States. So we already see that the tech war is hotting up in different ways, as well as the issue of monopoly is being raised in all of these, in this kind of discussions. So we have two really parallel issues that come up. One is how are national boundaries to be recognized when it comes to digital platforms? And this is really the app nationalization or app nationalism issue, which India has raised and which now Trump seems to be also raising. Other is, of course, the monopoly part of the digital platform. So I'll take a step back and go back to Soderbergh's book, Hacking Capitalism, and talk about the context in which this book was written and what we see today. If you see at that time, the free software movement or the open source movement, and this is the free and open source movement in a larger coalitional sense. I will not go into the difference between open source and free and open source software. Leaving that out, broadly, both of them were against monopolies. And they saw software monopolies as the key way that companies were amassing profits and amassing huge amounts of profits. And therefore, they said that this is not what is correct. Now, of course, there are two ideological impulses to the free and open source movement. One is that this is extraction of monopoly rent, because certain companies build monopolies through the software, and because some of the software is very critical to the functioning of the personal computers. In that time, it was really Microsoft Windows, through which Microsoft was extending its monopoly power into Word, into spreadsheets, into other platforms, and so on. So therefore, monopoly over code was seen to be the key instrument of monopoly, and therefore the argument that the code should be free. So this, as I said, had two parts to the freedom. One is free as freedom. This is what was also the slogan, that free as in freedom, not free as in beer. But the other part, which people like us were in the movement for, that we recognize intellectual property as an instrument of what is called monopoly rent. And I'll explain what monopoly rent is in just a moment. So that intellectual property is an instrument of monopoly rent, and software copyright was a source of this monopoly rent, which is how they were able to create a bigger monopoly. So you first create a monopoly, you get the major share of the money from the market because you have a monopoly, which everybody needs. And through that, you build yourself to be big enough by which you can buy other competition of different kinds, and then your monopoly position is retained. So this was the two sources of the free software movement, one of which was freedom. And I will say that this combined, therefore, a mixture of left and libertarian ideology. And I'll come to that again in a moment, that this left and libertarian ideologies coming together built a strong movement against copyright being the principal instrument of using software. And therefore, if you could break that monopoly, it was felt that it will democratize the field of using technology. Now, this was going hand in hand at the time with also development of the internet. So there are, of course, other players who are coming into the field, who are coming in basically as internet players. There the battle was between the telecom companies, who saw that the telecom platform, basically the wired or the wireless services, are the ones on which internet services are delivered. By virtue of their monopolies over the wire, they argued that they should get a cut of whatever pie anybody is selling. So they were the first who tried to build the argument that through monopolies, we have a platform. If we use our platform, in this case, the telecom platform, then you need to give us a cut of whatever income that you are earning. So this was resisted widely because it was felt that telecom companies who already had a bad record as monopolists in the United States, AT&T was being broken up because it was seen to be a monopoly. Therefore, it was felt that if we do not want monopolies, and people, even in the United States, felt that monopolies was not good for them. They earlier had the railroad monopolies, which had actually made life miserable for people who are the primary producers, who needed rail in the United States because a large country to, for instance, sell goods from agrarian hinterland of the United States to the cities. And the railways were extracting monopoly rent, monopoly profits, and therefore this whole argument, monopolies are not good. There are anti-monopoly bodies which are set up, which were called monopoly commissions, and there was a telecom monopoly regulator who was set up precisely to stop monopolies, and therefore the argument was that content and carriage is the one which carries the content, which is essentially telecom platforms. Carriage and content should be separated, and therefore if telecom players want to play, they can, but they cannot discriminate against people who are using their carriage. And this argument is what finally led to the fact that in the United States, a whole bunch of people could come up and play on the internet without having to pay exorbitant costs to the telecom players. And that was primarily because telecom everywhere in the world is recognized as a monopoly, and it is regulated. Even in India, you have the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, whose one of its tasks is to, of course, control monopoly. Now, it's not happened because Jio has clearly become a monopoly, the number one monopoly in telecom today. But the purpose of Telecom Regulatory Authority is still to fight monopolies, even if it doesn't do so. So that's true for the United States also right now, because their Telecom Regulatory Authority is headed by an Indian origin, Ajit Pai. He is also given up monopoly control. So this is the monopoly which the telecom companies did not build. What we find is over the next 10, 12 years, you have major internet monopolies that have emerged. The GAFA, in fact, apart from Apple, which is a device monopoly, GAFA, in fact, both Google, Facebook, and Amazon represent major digital platforms. And the services they provide quite often are free, not Amazon, but Facebook and Google. But that's not the point. The point is now communication between us does not take place to the internet as we think. It really takes place within Google or within Facebook. So what has happened is in place of what used to be called the edge connected networks, each node on the net is supposed to be an edge, and you can connect to any edge anywhere in the world. What you get is essentially a network in which edges only connect through Google. So Google, in effect, is what you and I connect to when you write a mail to each other. So this whole process of colonizing the internet, so to say, is creating a different kind of monopoly. And as we know from the congressional hearings, for instance, that Amazon as a platform, how much does it charge the person who produces the goods? It's about 30%. That's what the congressional hearings said. So if you're a producer who needs the internet to sell today, because essentially the whole trading structure that existed and the shops that existed, what I call in the United States, the mom and pop shops have shut shop. So effectively, if you want to reach the market, you have to use the internet. And there, if you want to do it all by yourself, you're very unlikely to be able to reach a market. And most people then look for goods in Amazon, in India, and Flipkart, other places, similar platforms in China, Alibaba. So all of this means that you then depend on certain platforms. And if you're a producer or you are a consumer, you pay to, on both sides, you have to pay a certain amount of money. The major part of the money that is paid by the producers who cannot access the market without going through Amazon. And as I said, it's about 30%. In the case of Apple, again, we have a small visibility on what Apple does. It's now known that Apple, through its App Store, and App Store is an application that people use, Apple has to pay 30%, people have to pay 30% of their income to Apple. So this is what is called monopoly rent. And I said I will explain what is monopoly rent. Monopoly is the rent is the extra money effectively that you get because you are the sole or the major supplier of that service. And if people then have to access your service, you can ask them to pay an amount of money, which till the point they can find an alternative, they have to pay you or go out of business. Now, we also know that Amazon is driving people who are coming to the Amazon to sell, they're driving them into bankruptcy. But as long as new players continuously come up, Amazon really doesn't have to care. So this is the monopoly rent you were seeing today. And this has changed the way when we're talking about free and open source software, we used to look at the world. This is a different world because at that point of time, Google, Facebook were not the major players. In early 2000, which is where this whole book is actually set, at that time, Microsoft was the major player, IBM was another player, but these were not players who were actually selling services. They were selling software. They were saying hardware and software infrastructure. IBM was a major supplier to the industry, basically providing industry-wide services. But all of them depended on the software being a monopoly for themselves or for selling into the market. And that was a strength that they saw, that they had software that was technology, and they had the platform, which was, of course, hardware. And they either sold bundled hardware and software, which is what IBM did, or use software services and license fees, which is what Microsoft did, as well as, for instance, Oracle as a database company does. So this was the market at that point of time. So if we want to place today the free software movement in that context, it was against monopolies. They thought, a lot of the people thought they will create a completely new ecosystem. Yes, theoretically, we did create a new ecosystem in the fact that we have driven out almost most monopoly producers of software, but we have not created a socialist production system out of it. What we have created is that people are giving their services free for certain companies who then support them. It's not that the open source community does not receive support from Google or Facebook. They do. But the products that they produce, are then used by these major companies and to basically build their platform monopolies. So you have this strange issue that comes up that yes, we broke the software monopolists. Microsoft and others have now more or less accepted they have to live in a world in which software patents or software license fees are not going to be the major issue. In fact, Microsoft's a major chunk of its income still comes from the Windows operating system, which is bundled with a number of PCs sold as such. But it also comes from now increasingly, in fact, comes from the services it sells to corporations as essentially industry level, like Amazon, industry level supporting big business. So you have big support by Amazon being given to industries who want to use the virtual world for storing their data, storing their applications, making it available, because duplicating all those resources in-house is becoming increasingly difficult. So both Amazon and Microsoft both have emerged as major players in this market. And Microsoft's increasingly, though even today its major part of its revenue comes from the monopoly over the PC platforms, but nevertheless it is also branching out quite heavily into essentially what would be called web services to the industry. Its focus is not individuals, because that is Facebook and Google, who holds the consumers, who can sell advertisements to them, and their focus is really, like Amazon, on not an advertisement so much as services to big industries. Of course, Amazon is growing in advertisement at the moment, but if you take a company like Amazon who sells products, If it wants to take advertisements, like Google comes into question. Does your search engine throw up only those platforms which you have a tie-up with, your captive platforms, or is it open? Is it really search engine independently throwing us what is best for us? Amazon could also come under similar questions. So there is a contradiction there. But if we take a step back and look at it now, we'll see web services, essentially infrastructure services on the web, Amazon and Microsoft. You have Apple, which has a hardware platform and a software platform. It's a closed platform through which it offers a whole bunch of stuff, but its main money comes from bundling the services, the software, and the hardware together, and it's producing a premium phone. As you might be aware, that in the smartphone market, it is no longer the market leader. In fact, Huawei and Samsung sell more smartphones than Apple does. It's not that Apple gets the largest amount of money. That's also not true. Even in terms of the total turnover, in terms of selling smartphones, Apple is now probably number 3. Of course, Huawei, after taking the hit of the sanctions, may have gone down a bit. Others, Huawei and Samsung, were both ahead of Apple. But in terms of profits, Apple still has about 60 to 70% of the profits of the smartphone industry, because all said and done, the point is Apple is a premium product, and people are willing to pay more money for buying an Apple phone, which is not very different from a Samsung high-end phone or a Huawei high-end phone, but nevertheless people are able to they're willing to pay a larger price to Apple. So it has what would be called the marketing appeal to be the number 1 in the smartphone market, and a bit of a shall we say also the value of being, I have an iPhone, you see, I have an iPad kind of value, and therefore it is able to take a larger share of profits by charging what is called again monopoly rent. So that means that the premium is by virtue of the monopoly it has, that people think it's the best product in the smartphone market. So if I look at all of this, what am I really saying is that the income of these companies are coming from 2 sources. One is, of course, from the consumer itself, in case of an iPhone, or it comes from those companies which want to ask Google, Microsoft, or for instance Amazon for services, for putting up data centers, putting up their banking applications on a backbone and Amazon or Google servers or Microsoft servers, what is called, I think, the Azure platform. So all these are basically what companies then ask them for, and they pay money. Then you have the advertising market, which of course for Google and Facebook is a primary money earner, because the advertisers know that if you put your ads on Google, you're more likely to get more eyeballs than anybody else. They also know who are the likely buyers. They have probably done a Google search to see what is it that is good. For instance, today I want to buy something for my house. I'm looking at maybe a microwave oven. I do a search on Google, and then Google automatically starts showing me what are the premium brands I should buy. And of course, that ad is paid for by the company which produces those products. So Google today has roughly, in the global market, today has, along with Facebook, about possibly 40 to 50% of the ad revenue it gets. You can go and look at the figures, because every year the increasing digital ads are increasing, and today digital ad revenue has outstripped all other ad revenues, including television. At some point, I think by 2022, it was expected to outstrip all the other ad revenues combined. With the lockdown, you probably see that happening faster. So you have at the ad revenue. Where does that money come from? That money comes from those who produce goods. Again, not software, not hardware, but produce goods. Of course, it can also be software and hardware, but this is all goods that are produced. And then Google and Facebook, by virtue of their access they're giving to us, takes a cut of the top. So again, this is essentially what I will call as monopoly rent. Monopoly being they have the monopoly of eyeballs, and therefore they are the most prized advertisers for those who want to sell goods. Amazon, by virtue of controlling the product of the goods that are being sold, also of course charges a monopoly rent. So where does the monopoly rent really come from? Now, I will go back to basic Marxist understanding of history, that ultimately it's a labor which produces goods. And if labor produces goods, then if an advertiser is basically has to be is paying, he's really paying out of the money he's going to recover from the consumer. But that money he's going to recover from the consumer, he may pay to the company which shows the advertisements, but the price of goods then is built into this, and that price of goods is what finally people are paying for, and the goods that are produced by labor. So if we take advertisers' money, then it's really redistribution of the surplus, that the workers produce a surplus, a part of it remains with the capitalist, part of it goes to the advertiser. As long as the advertising world was not a monopoly one, you could decide, okay, I won't give the ads to Times of India, I'll give it to Hindustan Times. You could play on the fact there was competition in the field, but when it becomes a monopoly, that competition is gone. So they can demand a price, which means that even if you don't make a profit, in order to survive, you have to sell, and therefore you are forced to give to those who let you access the market. And in this case, whether it's an advertiser or it's an Amazon-like platform, I'm willing to pay more money in order for that to happen. So therefore, this is what is in classical Marxist terms, it's called redistribution of the surplus, that the surplus is still generated by labor, but it is redistributed in this particular way. Now, there are two questions that come up. What is the role that software people are playing in this? And it's very clear that without software, of course, you don't have a platform, whether it's Amazon, whether it's Facebook, or whether it's Google. So all these platforms have been built by technologies, and a lot of them started with a technological advantage, which may not have been significant. But like all networks, if one becomes bigger than others, then slowly that emerges as the monopoly, because all others, for their what is called the network effect, then want to go there because their friends are there. So though it is not true that Google necessarily has the best search engine, or Facebook, which started as a dating app, was the best dating app in the world at that point of time. But the fact that more and more people joined Facebook or search on Google meant that edge that they had got translated increasingly into what becomes the largest network of people on Google or Facebook, and therefore slowly that gives them the dominant monopoly position. This, as I said, is classical, what is called network effect, and this is what has created the monopoly for Google, Facebook, and of course Amazon. Except Amazon has an advantage, it's a monopoly to us who buy, it's also a monopoly to those who sell. This is what is called a double-sided monopoly. That was true, for instance, for Walmart, who also had a double-sided monopoly, but in the physical world. Now the Walmart kind of double-sided monopoly has become translated into the double-sided monopoly of Amazon. Wrapping this part up, so the software industry should not think it produces the major part of the surplus value, because the software companies become so huge. Today, the 5 most leading corporate houses in terms of market capitalization is the GAFA, the 4 we have named, and Microsoft. Apart from Berkshire Hathaway, which also occurs among the first 5, sometimes not. So if you take Berkshire Hathaway, which is Warren Buffett's investment company, and their major investments are in what is called tech, and tech today really means software and hardware. So if you take that into account, the biggest monopolies in the world today are these so-called tech companies. And the fact that they have become so big is also interesting, because we have never had the growth of monopoly at such a fast rate ever in the world. Now, this probably is another day's discussion. We can do it some other time. But without venture capital, this kind of transformation may not have occurred. Venture capital does not fund, for instance, for the profit it is going to see once the investment bears fruit. They essentially want people to create monopolies. If monopolies succeed, then of course they can sell their shares at a much bigger price. So they fund for longer duration in the hope of building a monopoly in that company. That company will build a specific kind of monopoly. It can be Airbnb, it can be other kinds of monopolies like Uber, for instance. And once that monopoly is created, they know the monopoly rent can be extracted from the consumers. And once you can extract the the rent from the consumers, in the case of Airbnb, of course, it is from the house owners or hotels which convert to Airbnbs. In the case of Uber, it is the drivers who own the cars who then allow it to be used. So once you get that monopoly, you can squeeze on both sides, both the consumers of the services as well as those who own the services, without actually having to invest in any of that. So this kind of creation of monopolies is the objective. Would not have happened if we did not have venture capital available. And venture capital became available in large quantities because in the advanced capitalist world, infrastructure is not something they were spending. Money was available for investment. Third world was looked upon as if it could be dangerous. You can get wars, you can get expropriation of their money. And therefore, the safe haven of the capitalist world, the United States, Western Europe, meant that you want to build services for these places. And if there is a monopoly which is built on service of some kind, then that will give you the fastest appreciation of capital. This is why Amazon, Google, Facebook have seen huge investment that have come into them through venture capital and other funds. So this is the structure of the world which is there. I'm going to conclude by looking at one specific element of the structure, which is, if you take, for instance, in the 80s, you will see, if we take the amount of what would be called the physical assets is buildings, machines, all those kind of goods, then capital, 80% of capital is what would be called tangible assets. It was something would feel and touch. Okay, that's what the assets were. If you saw, the bigger company had the bigger manpower, labor force. It also had large revenues. That means what it sold. That's called the amount it sold. If you take that, it also sold much more than others. The two sectors which were actually in some sense parasitic were oil as well as the banks, the financial sector. The pharmaceutical sector had not become big as yet, because that is also an intellectual property. It also becomes big, and it's pretty big now. So you see, in the 80s, it was still tangible capital, which is the largest share of capital that was there. If you take today, it is flipped the other way around. 80% of the assets of a company are intangible assets. In the case of Apple, it's Apple name. The name itself guarantees I have superior premier products. Or it is services which I monopolize, Google, Facebook, Amazon. So the intangible assets today command the 80% of the capital of these companies, which means increasingly they have become what would be called, in capitalist terminology, not Marxist terminology, as rentiers. They extract monopoly rent from the market, and the clearest indication of that is the structure of what they own today and what they owned, say, in the 80s. So this whole transformation has taken place in this way. What has happened to the free software community? It's interesting, because the free and open source community used to have huge, conclaves, meetings, a very vibrant community in the early 2000 to 2010 or 12. Today, where are they? they are essentially working for Google or Facebook as contractors. A lot of the Snowden revelations tools are actually free software tools. One of them, in fact, has in its slide also the word FOSS stated, because these are Hadoop, etc. They all came out of the free software. So the entire creativity of the software programmers who thought they were actually fighting monopoly goes into build the Google, the Facebook, all these platforms. All of them support Facebook. All of them support free software. In fact, they put back their technology into the market, whether it is React, whether it is some other platform software framework, as it is called. All these are given because they want that energy to still continue, the independent development of tools. So they put their own to develop tools also into the market to freely available to people, so that you build communities around it, and then you can get back from the communities what you need. So this whole enterprise of free and open source software today is backed by big platforms as well, because they see that it benefits them to get the best of software from the market without actually having to pay for it, except in terms of putting it back into the market. And they can access all these people in terms of services, saying that, look, you come and build free software for me, and I guarantee that you can put it back into the market as free software. So there is no harm in this. This is in line with what anyway your philosophy is. So that whole community of free software and free and open source software, which is so vibrant in the 2000 to 2010, today has become really adjunct to the major monopolies of the world, which is essentially, in this particular case, is really Google and Facebook. And Microsoft has said, yes, the future is free and open source software. We are going to also convert, and we are not competing with free and open source software. We would like to keep our feet on two boats. If you want private software in your personal computer, Windows, that is fine. But we are no longer opposing as we did earlier. And some of the areas they've even given up. So they still want to fight using Bing and other platforms. But they've more or less decided that that is not the platform. In the long term, that will work for them. So they are switching, as I said, to business enterprise solutions, where they think they can get captive market, and they are competing with Amazon to be the largest players in that space. In fact, Google is also there, but Google's services are much closer to people like you and me. And to companies, they seem to have not been as successful as Microsoft or, for instance, Amazon has been. AWS is it's something that almost a lot of companies the worldwide use as a default platform. If you don't want your own infrastructure, then you use Amazon service. With this, I'm going to stop here because I think my 40 minutes are nearly up, which is what my target was. So effectively, the world from the free software, which was the only battle that we were fighting in the early 21st century, end 90s, early 21st century, the battle was over monopolies, though it was couched in the terms of free and open source software. The monopoly of that time used to be software monopolies. Today, it has become really platform monopolies. And when you want to fight that, then you need to understand the underlying structure of capital and how that has changed the terms of what we were fighting for. And if we want to fight today, we will have to rethink our strategy. I'm going to make one last point here. Is it possible to fight? The answer is yes. What it has shown that it is possible for people to come together and quote unquote liberate knowledge. And if we can build a movement which combines the producers with the software people who provide a certain specific kind of services which are absolutely necessary in order for producers to be able to reach the market, I think you can try and build different kinds of platforms. But it's a long haul. It's not going to happen by just sitting on the keyboard. It is linking up with the producers collective, trying to see whether the workers can run factories, workers can run production units. Are those collectives possible today? Can collective ownership be combined with the software community, knowledge community, not just software, but the need, for instance, intellectual knowledge, the need knowledge of different kinds? Can all of this come in a cooperative framework and build a kind of a socialist alternative within capitalism initially, but then confronting capitalism itself? Let's not forget, all these attempts will partially succeed, will partially fail. Each time we do something which succeeds, there will be capitalist forces which will contest with that and try and take it over. So this is not a one-time solution which will reach. Just as we thought with free and open source software, we'll liberate software and build a kind of socialist alternative in this space. That has not happened. In fact, we've got bigger monopolies. So whatever we do, the problem is not going to go away, because ultimately the problem is not just a social relationship called capital, but behind that the state and the military power of the state, which comes into play to regulate society in favor of capital. So that is the last battle we have to fight, that it is also about who controls the state and who controls state power. I'm going to leave it here because I think this has gone into a very large area already, so I don't want to extend it further. Thank you very much for listening to me patiently. Now questions.
Okay. We'll start from the people who joined last. Saran, VMS, have any questions? You start off with Saran.
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Go ahead.
My question is, how does hacker movement been a place struggle rather than a class struggle?
Come again, please repeat that.
How does hacker movement been seen as a place struggle rather than a class struggle?
That is the Soderbergh in talking about play and how play can be a part of struggle. I am not going to go by certain definitions that people have given for themselves. He also looking at how culture comes into this. I think that one thing we have to understand, that as Marxists, we tend to look at not at individual consumption, but as social consumption. When you talk about production and consumption, we're not talking of just individual consumptions being added up. So when you talk about consumption of music, consumption of culture, now consumption is the end, that is not where you start from. You really have to talk about production as a primary way of looking at social systems, because consumption assumes there is production. So what you are talking of is collective production of culture. And yes, of course, you can have collective production of culture, groups coming together, people singing, people performing. We had again a vibrant people's theater movement. All of these are really, you have to focus on production. And I think Soderbergh understands it by the end of the book. And his essential part of it is that you cannot start all of this from the consumption end. So when you look at production, now of course production needs consumers, so there is that part of it, but consumption is not the primary activity. Primary activity is production, but it must be useful production. It must perform something which people need for them to be able to consume. So unfortunately, a lot of this play part, as he himself says, descends into individualized consumption. And individualized consumption does not produce collectives. So that's why I was focusing on that when you talk about collectives, that class struggle is the consciousness which says that I have to fight along with others. So class struggle means that people have to build collectives through which they fight. Even production has to be then, if you want to make the terrain of struggle as production, you have to produce as collectives. And unfortunately, a lot of the social consciousness within the quote unquote hacker community is I am the great one, and I will build this fantastic software which will revolutionize the world. So it became a part in which others could consume without being in production. And the producers saw themselves as the elite who could do things others could not. But I must make one caveat here. When you think of class struggle, and this is, I'm indebted to Julian Assange, for making this particular point, which he did once when I heard him, that he said that capitalism cannot be overthrown. And this is after he was completely isolated. He was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy. He said it cannot be overthrown by individuals. So it needs sustained organized struggle. And he said, I didn't understand this when I started my battle against imperialism. I thought that, people could deliver such blows and the system would collapse. That cannot happen. But he also said, and this is, I think, important, that there are people who can deliver deep blows by virtue of the fact that they have technological skills of a certain kind which others don't. And this kind of technology skills can be used to deliver serious blows to the imperialist, shall we say, credibility. So the WikiLeaks, for instance, all the papers that came out, which were the cables that the US embassies were exchanging with the head office. Once that treasure trove comes out in public domain, you will find that so much information is available. People are still finding information which is valuable to their struggle. In fact, the Diego Garcia Island, those who are removed by United Kingdom, removed from the island and were dumped somewhere else, 2,000 kilometers, 3,000 kilometers away, they won their battle in the international court by virtue of the fact that WikiLeaks gave in details what the UK government had planned with the United States. So these are some of the things that, yes, as communities we can do, but I would not call it the joy of playing or as the consciousness that builds a different consciousness, because the joy of playing can be very much an individual exercise, and it can therefore become very inward looking and become in that sense very it helps, it makes you feel good, but at the end of it, it may not generate social good. So combining personal good with social good is not an easy exercise. And quite often if you see a film or you write a script or you play music, it's not individual play that matters. It's the fact that if you do it as a collective and you connect to the audience through a collective, I think the collective part is very important. And I think these are the things that we have to think about when you talk about what is collective consciousness, which I would say is class consciousness. What's the difference between a collective consciousness and class consciousness? Class consciousness has objectives in mind and its purposive activity for a certain end. A collective consciousness which does not have that is therefore not class consciousness. And without class consciousness, you're not going to break the power of the monopolies in the world today. Yep. Come again. I'm sorry, you didn't get the question. What capitalism? Surveillance capitalism. Yeah. That's, you see, because he's 2007, surveillance capitalism is basically using personal data for the purpose of selling us to corporations. Okay, so we are the commodity. Our data is not really the commodity, but our data is used to fine tune the viewership, so to say, and therefore micro targeting is possible with our data. But essentially, what the commodity is what is called the audience commodity. Now, audience commodity is a part of surveillance capitalism. Okay, that means you surveil. The Google surveils us. It knows, Facebook and Google's know us better than obviously our parents, because they don't know as much that Google and Facebook does about us. So this is the kind of profiling they can do for us, therefore makes it possible to target very narrowly. And that's why the word surveillance capitalism comes in from that point of view, that if it takes our data and targets it. But this is the development of the last 10, 12 years. At the time when Soderbergh really wrote his book, these aspects were really not there. These aspects were just emerging. So I don't think that consciousness with which we look at all of this today is a consciousness which is possible for us to have at that age. So I'll give him a pass on that one, that I don't think it was his fault, because Google had not become the monopoly it is today. It has taken in the last 10, 12 years, it's really built this monopoly. Amazon was seen to be a trading monopoly. We didn't understand the impact it was going to have. We saw it as just a merchant on the internet who would use scale at a certain level. So I think, yes, we have changed our outlook on all of this. And surveillance capitalism is also the fusion of the state with this kind of capital. Because without that support of the United States, I do not think Google, Facebook would have the kind of power they have in the market today, because most countries would have used some tool or the other to curb their power, as European Union is now trying to do. So yes, I think that is a miss in the book, but that's because the book was written in 2007 or I think published in 2008, but written before that. It must have taken him 3-4 years to write as well.
So, VMS, you have any questions?
Yes. Hi, Prabir.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is on the software licenses, basically. So how does the software license enable capitalism to promote? I mean, creating monopolies. So the thing is that we have free software licenses and then we have open source licenses, which basically have some kind of lacks in them, which enables one to convert software that is in the public domain into a monopoly. So I have a question on that part.
Yeah, so you see that there is the battle over the kind of licenses, but the broad issue is, first, what is the role of intellectual property and therefore a software license? Software license is a copyright. It's like a pharmaceutical company saying that this particular molecule is something I have developed, therefore anybody who uses this molecule has to take permission. Even if the molecule is there in nature, because I have put it together, I have discovered it, I have found its value, therefore I own a patent. So copyright is similar to a patent, except it is for a much longer duration. And because software is about really copyright, so you can take the same principle on which the software has been built and write a different code. And then they can fight you in a court of law saying he has stolen my idea, but he's probably unlikely to win. So licenses are essentially instruments of monopoly. That's the first thing to understand. And instruments of monopoly recognized by the state. And because it's recognized by the state, it can bar you or stop your activities or say you cannot do this particular thing because you're using somebody else's software, which you have not paid for. So this is like the pharmaceutical companies. Like, for instance, Remdesivir, Gilead Science has a monopoly. It costs $10 to make in the United States, probably $3, $4 to make in India, but yet it sells for 32,000 rupees for file of 6, and it sells also for I think $3,000 in the United States for a file of 6. So where is that money coming from? It's coming because by law he has got a monopoly through the patent. Okay. In the case of software, it's a copyright. So it's an instrument is the same, intellectual property. The specific form of the instrument is my code. I have written, it belongs to me. I, in this case, could be the company. So it's enforced by the courts. It's enforced by the state. So that's how the monopoly remains. So when you talk about open source and free software licenses, there are many kinds of licenses available because essentially the free software license is under copyright. So what are we doing? When we say it's copy left, what we mean is I'm giving you a license to use this provided you observe the condition of my license, which is you must make it available under a similar license. This is why the word viral license is used, that it cannot be converted into private license. But here are the issues, that there is the GPL license. Now I think it's GPL version 3 license is there. It's quite complicated, and there are different parts to the GPL license. You can give it under A, B, C, D. Various conditions can be created. But there are other free software licenses also, and somebody could give a free software license which says, I give it to the world, and they can convert it to private property if they want. This is a non-viral license, and Apache free software license is of that kind. So it can be privatized. I can say, take it, add 3 lines of code to it and say it's mine. Okay, so that it allows. And the software again have these possibilities that I can still make them into, I can convert them so that they become, other companies can own it in terms of private property of some kind. But nevertheless, one thing has happened. It's very clear that the strength of the free software movement has been that people have realized that this kind of technology development by teams working together, working in a particular way, modularizing the software produces much better software. And because companies like Google, Facebook use these kind of tools in their production, they have in fact also promoted free and open source software communities for their own benefits. So yes, NSA, you'll be surprised, maybe you would not be. NSA is one of the biggest supporters of free software as well. You're getting the best creative minds in the world contributing to software which you need, for which you don't have to build a large team, which generally is not very creative. So this particular way of building software, which is still very much centered on skills of a few individuals. In fact, one can do this exercise, how much of free software is actually the core of it, really the advanced core of it, how many people have contributed to it. Probably out of 100 free software people writing code, the core of it is probably written by about 3 to 5 people. So those 3 to 5 people may not be willing to work for corporations. Therefore, they also are promoting an ecosystem of free software. So it's not so much what kind of licenses. These 10 years back, we fought those battles. Today, let's face it, Google's monopoly, Facebook's monopoly, and NSA's dominance is built on free software. So let's not be, let's not close our eyes to that reality as well. That battle was a different battle. Today we are fighting a different kind of monopolies. We are not fighting software monopolies anymore. We are really fighting platform monopolies, and that's a different fight. And we're not going to win that fight by just fighting over licenses.
Yeah, thanks, Prabir.
Prabir, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So while we talk about alternatives, so strengthening the alternatives, like in terms of softwares or in terms of the platform itself, like cooperatives. So the other approach that what we could think of also mentioned in the book is like the knowledge which has been commodified or from which the monopoly has been constructed is produced by the working class. the labor, the commons, the people are producing. So why do we need to isolate from that and produce an alternative rather than owning that what we have produced and given to the monopoly itself? So how does that struggle differs? Like, so we at one point, yeah, talk about free software usages and building a strong free software mode. So seeing as an alternative from this monopoly, but the data which we have produced, for example, in YouTube or Instagram, anything. So it's what being produced by the people. So why
I
can't
got the
we?
question. I got the question. You don't have to repeat it. So there are two quick interjections. One is, it's clear that the battle is not about basically the kind of license. That's why I talked about licenses in such detail. The what battle is really in that arena is about intellectual property, therefore intellectual property versus commons. But the problem that we get is when we come to data. The data, who does it belong to? Whose data is it? Is it my data? Is it your data? It's really the data of the network. So how do we create a data commons? How do we create that without violating privacy is the big challenge over there. And there are no easy answers. For instance, I belong to a platform in which we talk about internet and various other issues, and which Paraminder, for instance, has tried to put forward the idea of data being held jointly at fiduciary, state and a fiduciary of the people. That means state on behalf of the people will hold the data. Well, how do you prevent the state from giving it to geo or using it for surveillance purposes? Not surveillance capitalism, but direct surveillance. So commercializing of the data, how does it help the people? We don't know. So yes, this is a battle we have to work out. What is the under, let's put it this way, under capitalism, what do we do with data? How do we hold data? If we make privacy the paramount part, well, in that case, are we saying data cannot be commercialized at all? Is that today possible? So those are kind of questions we have to answer. But nevertheless, let me put it this way, that the monopoly is not coming from monopoly over simply data. Data is an instrument of either selling goods to us or selling us. So the battle of struggle is not battle over data, but it's over how goods are produced and how goods are sold. And that is the bigger battle we have to fight. Don't think by fighting over software or data, we are going to win that fight. Unless these fights all come together and you are able to fight basically capital as a social relations, capitalist backed by the state as the people who have to be dispossessed of their power, we're not going to win that fight. So how do you bring all of it together is our challenge. But anything which restricts us to only thinking of software or data then divorces us from the physical social reality within which we are. And I think Soderbergh says all of this in his last summary chapter. So I have to confess, as I was reading the summary chapter, I think it's been written, it was written at the end. So by the time already some of the things that I'm talking about are emerging. So he does talk about postmodernism, he does talk about fragmentation, alienation of the individual, thinking of themselves as consumerist, becoming a kind of narcissist, all these things he says. And he finally does say the struggle is really the social struggle that we have to wage. And commons is, of course, the terrain on which the ideological battle has to be fought. But the battle is not just an ideological battle. Battle is also a physical battle, which you have to fight. So we have to put forward, you have to dispossess monopolies as a first instance. Now, as you can see, in the most capitalist country in the world, the United States, there already talks about monopolies being dangerous. This has not been heard about in the United States for the last 70 years, okay? Chief Justice Brandeis was referred to, or Justice Brandeis referred to, he says, we can have either democracy or we can have monopoly. We can't have both. So the anti-monopoly part has come back after a long, long time in the United States. So I think those are the kind of things we have to see. And of course, our big monopolist, Mr. Ambani, is there because Jio is the platform which you have to contend with. It's not, in this case, Google, Facebook, All of them want to get onto the Geo platform because here we have got good old-fashioned telecom monopoly combining with the global monopolist to get an even more powerful monopoly combination against us in India. So these are the battles that we have to fight here. How do you liberate ourselves from Geo stranglehold?
Yeah. Thanks, Prabir. So I also have one more last question from my
Last
side.
question.
So yeah. So how do we see as a free software movement ourselves linked to the class friends? Like if you are talking about information technology, so in the last chapter of this book, Play Struggle of Hackers, this author also talks about unions, class struggles, so labor rights, those things. So as a free software movement, what is our approach to that? Is it something to be considered as an evolution from the free software movement to unions, from mass friends to the class friends? So how do we have an understanding of that? So
As
based
I
on our
said,
work,
the
yeah.
battle is not just organizing the free software movement people as software unions. The battle is really for the producers and the supporting those unions. So, for instance, the unions need tech support. Okay, working with them to provide the tech support from the free software community could also be a part of it. If the struggles they are waging, linking ourselves to those struggles, using the tools that we have, helping them in the struggles is also a part of that. So we should not regard unions as just building unions of software people, because at the end of it, software people are still privileged because you get a share of the pie that Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple get. Okay, so basically these are what would be called in class terms the privileged part of the working class. They are the ones
Okay.
which, for instance, earlier in UK, Great Britain, the working class there was labor aristocracy. So yes, you produce surplus value, but your surplus value is small. The monopoly rent that they get is much bigger. But because they get a much bigger monopoly rent, they are willing to pay you high wages. So workers, software workers, are labor aristocracy. So let's be very clear about them. Unionizing labor aristocracy is, yes, of course, we can do it. It's not that we shouldn't do it, but that is only a part of it. Exposing the stranglehold of big software big not software, digital monopolies in the world today, exposing how they are controlling the world, how they are actually controlling money. Google now is also Google Pay. Facebook wants to print its own money. What it calls is some Facebook, I forget the name, Libra or something. So all of these are now becoming banks, they're becoming financial houses. They are going to give all the services in the world except produce it, okay, produce goods. So all this fight needs people to expose what they're doing, making it clear and suggesting how therefore the monopoly power needs to be broken. And talking therefore of surveillance capitalism is as important as, for instance, unionizing the labor aristocracy of the software workers.
Yeah. Thanks, bro.
Yes, you don't have to agree with me. You can keep on discussing this. This is my point of view. That's
Yeah.
okay.
I just want to. Yeah, author has said covered certain sections of this in the last chapter. So I also want to know your view on that.
Yeah. I've sort of given my quick reading view of Soderbergh's book, but you guys have to read it more. I'm too old to read books and come to new things. And don't expect me to give answers. My talking to you is for you to develop your answers, not for me to give you answers, in which case I'm failing in my basic duty. If I can't make you think more, I failed in talking to you.
Sure. Yeah, definitely, bro.
Okay. Okay. Thank
Yeah.
you very much. I'm going to quit now.
Thank you, Prabir. Thank you for that.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Prabir.
Prabir. Thanks for your time.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Bye.